My name is Frederick Lavoie, and I'm a research assistant at the Jean Monnet Network on Transatlantic Trade Politics. This is part of a series of interviews for that network called the Transatlantic Trade Videos. We are here today with Crina Viju-Miljusevic, who is Associate Professor at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. She's also Associate Director of the Center for European Studies, which includes the Jean Monnet Network. Welcome, Professor Viju, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you, Frederick. It's nice being here with you today.
My first question then. In a 2017 article of yours, you described the role of international trade in improving food security. Could you explain what you mean by that and how this applies to trade deals between developed regions like Canada, the United States, or the European Union? Is it different from how the issue is handled in trade deals with other parts of the world?
Thank you for the question. I think that's a very good question, and in my research, I have looked through different perspectives to this question. First of all, when we talk about food security, we have to think that it entails three main components: two that are of immediate concern, and one that is a long-run phenomenon. My research is focused mainly on the long-run effects of food security or reasons for food security. However, to define these components in short term, food availability is probably the most obvious. One has to think of the reaction if there is a threat of some kind of major storm or a crisis. Panic buying is often occurs. With supermarket shelves emptying quickly, just the fear that there will be no food availability or drinking water. A second short-run component of food security is related to the resources needed to buy the food. Well-stocked supermarkets do not provide security to people that don't have the financial means to buy this food. So this will be probably the most obvious aspects of food security, which are considered to be short-term effects. However, the long-run facets of food security relates to agricultural productivity. And in fact, without taking into account agricultural productivity, one of the expectations of the 18th century was that given the increase in population, the world will face a very important food crisis. But even currently, given global population projections and outlining a deceleration in agricultural productivity, some countries around the world still face the risk of food insecurity, and those countries are mainly located in the world's poor. Beyond the need for increased agricultural productivity, open international trade is another aspect that plays a role in ensuring food security and in enhancing food security. Trade barriers can be a reason why food cannot be transported where it's needed. Thus, trade agreements are considered to be a mechanism through which trade is open, and thus it keeps and enhances food security. However, I have to mention that the multilateral trading system has been unable to achieve the same level of opening in agricultural food trade as in trade of other goods. One subset of agricultural products that have been the subject of our research has been the products produced with biotechnology, where trade restrictions are very high. While the World Trade Organization agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures sets out that trade barriers can be implemented only if based on scientific evidence, the European Union and other countries around the world are unable to live up to that commitment. And thus, countries have turned to preferential trade agreements, like the ones that you have mentioned in your question, to try to find some alternative rules for trade in these specific products. And here, I would like to outline that I'm using the biotech products only as an example to show what kind of issues can appear if countries have different regulatory measures. the trade restrictive impacts of these measures and other impacts that can result. So this threatens the achievement of food security in two main ways. First, it limits the ability of international movements of grain to places where it's needed. And second, it inhibits the potential markets for GM technologies, thus reducing the incentive to invest in research and development pertaining to the modern agriculture biotechnology.
So genetically modified crops could then play a role in reducing food insecurity. How have global trade deals, for instance, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, between Canada and the European Union, or the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, between the United States and the European Union, for example, how have they tried to handle this issue?
Well, that's another very good question. I think we have to take a step back and think of what are the realistic expectations regarding what can be accomplished in a trade agreement on such issues, complex issues, such as the rules for trading products of biotechnology. So what can these agreements achieve? And after we can see what they achieved, in fact. So traditionally, trade agreements deal with purely economic interests. In case where requests for protections are not coming from producers with a vested interest, but from consumers, environmentalists, or other groups of civil society, the issues likely lack an economic motivation, even though they do have important economic ramifications. In the case of GM crops, opponents may be motivated by concerns related to human health and threat to the environment. Thus, policymakers must find a common ground with policymakers in other countries of how to deal with this risk. And of course, harmonization means that all countries involved in a preferential trade agreement will have to agree that one standard set of rules is good enough for all of them. But this depends on the degree of divergence in standards, because as divergence is higher, the cost of adjustments are higher, and also the degree to which the existing standards reflect the preferences of the population. So if the cost of adjustments are high to harmonize to the standards of one of the countries involved in the preferential trade agreements, the only other way of achieving harmonization is by the countries involved in the trade agreement to come up with a new set of standards. In the case of sanitary and phytosanitary standards, this can be a very long and complex process. And you have to think that this cannot necessarily be achieved in a trade agreement negotiation, because first of all, trade agreements are negotiated by diplomats, often without technical expertise, and devising standards, whether based on science or not, requires a lot of technical expertise. Therefore, in the best case scenario, what can be accomplished in a trade agreement is the establishment of an institutional forum where harmonization negotiations can be mandated. So they will continue the negotiations after the agreement is started to be implemented. Now, we have looked at the biotechnology chapters in the CETA, the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. In the proposed biotechnology chapter of the initial EU-US Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and also the biotechnology chapter negotiated under the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. What was agreed in these agreements was that they would establish an ongoing forum where issues pertaining to trade in biotech products will continue to be discussed. So in our view, it was much less than could have been achieved in the best case scenario that I described before, because within these agreements, there is no mechanism to mandate negotiations to foster harmonization, nor any mechanism to ensure that negotiations would be concluded.
There have been significant protests against these trade deals, and you cite former European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, describing them as, quote, so often contested, but so unjustly, end quote. Would you agree with this assessment? What is motivating these protesters?
Well, the protests have been fueled mainly by the fear that lower standards will be imported to the European market. I mean, protesters have used examples such as chlorinated chicken, GMO products, hormone beef, invading the European market and thus putting a downward pressure on the European standards. The quote from the former president of the European Commission, Juncker, refers exactly to the opposite, that in fact the European Union is exporting its high standards, and these standards can be food standards, environmental, worker rights, and so on, beyond its borders. Now, the EU has registered different levels of success in externalizing its internal policies and regulatory measures through different foreign policy instruments. For example, the policies that are applied within the European continent in the neighborhood, such as enlargement, or the trade agreements included in Eastern Partnership, or those applied outside the European continent, such as development aid. So these standards, so the EU has been successful in externalizing these standards through these instruments. However, if we look at agreements with third parties, mainly developed countries such as Canada, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, the EU has achieved limited success regarding regulatory cooperation in terms of goods, food safety standards, competition laws, or environmental standards. And I think that the limited achievements are explained by the convergence on the basis of international standards, such as for motor vehicles, or equivalence, meaning no rule changes. I think another important success for the EU in this agreement, as related to agriculture, was the recognition of its geographical indicators by third parties. And geographical indicators are a form of intellectual property, which I'm not going to go into much details here. So I would say that I partly agree with the former president of the European Commission. The European Union is successful in exporting its higher standards in certain situations, however, is not a blanket statement. And I will certainly say that the protesters at the same time do not necessarily have a base for those kind of assessments, because as I mentioned in my previous discussion, we don't see a harmonization of standards which goes both ways, lowering your standards or having higher standards. So it doesn't mean that a trade agreement with Canada, for example, would allow all of a sudden the importation of the hormone beef, in the European market. And this, I think it's again explained by what I already mentioned before. The countries involved in trade negotiations with the EU have already developed very different national regulation, especially for food safety and environmental standards. Thus, harmonization or coordination of rules and standards will impose high costs on the country undertaking the change, and will certainly interfere in the domestic policy-making processes, which is a very sensitive issue. So it is hard to achieve the harmonization of rules in a preferential trade agreement, especially on issues that are so sensitive and they are supported by various groups of the civil society.
Why are these negotiations primarily being conducted bilaterally rather than at a global multilateral level, at the World Trade Organization, for example? What dynamics are at play here?
So I think the increased interest in preferential trade agreements was the result of the long and inconclusive multilateral trade negotiations, and also the fundamental shift in the global economic power. Additionally, you have to think that trade negotiations are not necessarily focused only on traditional aspects such as tariffs, which were quite easily negotiated in previous multilateral rounds of negotiations. And now it includes non-tariff barriers, services, investment, environment, labor standards, government procurement. So these issues are much more difficult to be negotiated at the multilateral level. And in fact, we have a clear example with what are known as the Singapore issues, which include, government procurement, trade facilitation, investment, and competitions, where they were tried to be negotiated at the WTO. And the move to expand the WTO scope by including these obligations were in fact resisted by many developing countries, including China and India. And I think the major underlying cause for disagreement over Singapore issue was fundamentally a different perspective on how economic development should happen and what is the role of the government in economic development. The European Union has taken the position that economic development can be achieved by replicating the institutional arrangements in modern market economy. So markets should play a very important role, while developing countries believe that intervening to assist local firms is central to the process of economic development. And also they fear that their firms cannot necessarily face the competition from much more technologically advanced and better managed Western firms. So they needed more restrictions in place, they needed more government intervention. So if these issues were not successfully negotiated at the WTO level, they were taken to be negotiated in preferential trade agreements.
In a more recent article written in 2019, you write that it was unclear whether the global trade paradigm was fading or simply flickering, whether the challenges posed to free trade by Brexit or by the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States would substantively change how trade was done, or whether the system would prevail. 2 years later, can you speak with more confidence as to the future?
Well, 2 years later, we are in a bit of a more difficult situation given the COVID-19 pandemic and the various trade restrictions that were imposed by certain countries, especially in medical goods. So if we are focusing on the EU and based on the discussion that we already had, I think the EU was successful in achieving trade liberalization, especially when we talk about traditional aspects of trade, such as tariffs. However, it registered limited success in terms of regulatory cooperation, in achieving stricter competition laws or higher environmental standards. The investment court and portfolio investment included in some of the preferential trade agreements, such as with Canada, are still awaiting ratification from the EU member states. So there are certain successes, but in certain areas, I would say the EU has registered a more limited level of success. But I would like to mention here that I'm focusing only on trade agreements. Other, success, for example, in environmental negotiations has been achieved in other type of agreements, in environmental agreements, and they are not necessarily through the trade agreements. However, I'm not discussing other non-trade agreements that the European Union has been part of. However, in a comprehensive discussion, you certainly have to take into account all other agreements that the EU has concluded. I think what is important, to return to your question, for the future at least, is negotiations with large developing countries. As in any area of global politics, multilateral trade negotiations will not be successful without devising a system that works and is accepted by everyone. And this applies as well to preferential trade agreements between developing and developed countries. And I think that will be a very important, step that will define of how, global economic relations will move on.
That ends our interview for today. And again, thank you, Professor Viju, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.